Continues next on AM 560, The Answer.
Now, from the Signature Bank Studios, this is Chicago's Morning Answer with Dan Proft and Amy Jacobson on AM 560, The Answer.
Top of the morning, Dan and Amy. We've talked a bit about what should be done and whether Trump should do what he has done with respect to the TikTok ban. Of course, he granted a 75-day extension on TikTok divesting from the Chinese Communist Party and turning itself over on some sort of deal to American ownership. 75 days, although, again, the provisions of the law as passed and signed don't really provide for what Trump did. But, I do appreciate the sort of Machiavellian nature of what he did, because I think what he has said and his comments on TikTok the other day sort of speak to this is, based on what he said, this Machiavellian approach, sort of taken TikTok hostage, and I think he's using that as another point of leverage with respect to President Xi and the Chinese Communist Party for more expansive interests than the corporate structure of TikTok America. But anyway, here's what POTUS had to say.
On the TikTok piece, President Trump, you and your members of your team now used to warn about the dangers of TikTok spying on Americans. What changed that you're not worried about that anymore?
Well, it depends on the deal. I mean, I may not do the deal or I may do the deal. TikTok is worthless. Worthless if I don't approve it. It has to close. I learned that from the people that own it. If I don't do the deal, it's worthless. Worth nothing. If I do the deal, it's worth maybe $1 trillion. $1 trillion. So if I do the deal I'm talking about doing it for the United States. If I do the deal for the United States, then I think we should get half.
The TikTok CEO.
In other words, I think the U.S. should be entitled to get half of TikTok. And congratulations, TikTok has a good partner. And that would be worth, could be $500 billion or something. It's crazy. The numbers are crazy. But it's worthless if the president doesn't sign, then it's worthless. If the president does sign, it's worth maybe $1 trillion. So I think, like a joint venture, I think we would have a joint venture with the people from TikTok.
A joint venture with the people from TikTok. We, meaning we, the federal government, is going to do a public-private partnership with a otherwise would-be private social media platform. That may be news to Kevin O'Leary and other interested parties in TikTok, but no, I'm not on board for that. That would immediately create all kinds of potential First Amendment issues. I don't know. I know there's some spitballing going on. I don't know, but I think there's a bit of a Machiavellian play here. For more on this and other legal matters, there are many to address, even in the first hours of the Trump administration. Pleased to be joined again by Andy McCarthy, former Chief Assistant U.S. Attorney and contributing editor at National Review. He's also the author of the bestseller Ball of Collusion, The Plot to Rig an Election and Destroy a Presidency. Andy, thanks for being with us again. Appreciate it.
My pleasure.
So the whole TikTok matter, let's start there. The 75-day extension to get a deal done, the prospect on a forced sale to a private entity, the prospect of a forced sale to a public-private entity, your view?
Well, I mean, you start with the basics, which is that Trump doesn't get to make the law. And, to have a situation where he takes an oath to faithfully execute the laws, and then, among the first thing he does in the first hours is flout a law of Congress, which, by the way, is a standard that he championed in his first administration, and they wouldn't let him do it by executive order. He needed an act of Congress. So now we've got not only an act of Congress, but one that the Supreme Court has endorsed, and he's violating it. And this idea of, that the United States government is going to become a partner in it. First of all, this whole idea, one of the worst things that ever happened, this got very popular in the Clinton days. It was popular in progressivism going back earlier in the 20th century. But this idea of public-private partnerships, that's just a terrible anti-liberty idea that we should run to the hills from every time we hear it. But TikTok's a private company. No one ever, when Congress enacted this law and when we debated it all, no one ever had the idea that the United States would become a partner with communist China in a social media platform. The idea was this was a private company. It's not a First Amendment case. It's a national security case because the idea is not to shut down TikTok unless they don't have somebody qualified to operate it. It's that you can stop a hostile regime from operating a company like that in our jurisdiction. So the idea was to make China divest, or its cat's paw here, ByteDance, and sell it to another private company, not for the United States government to take it over.
Yeah, well, no, I agree. And with respect to that, I mean, for our listeners, particularly in Illinois, I mean, we've raised holy hell, rightfully so, about Governor Pritzker here doing a public-private partnership to the tune of $500 million with Goshen, which is a Chi-Com-backed EV battery plant in exurban Chicago, on a range, on a range of issues with that. And so, I mean, the same thing would apply here. I mean, it's one thing to leverage it, and maybe he's just leveraging it rhetorically, but right, he wants to get the sale done. The Biden administration wasn't going, essentially deferred. We're not going to enforce it. We'll leave it up to Trump to decide whether or not to enforce it. And right now, that's where things are at. And
can I say one other thing, though?
Yes, please.
If he's right that it's worth $1 trillion, then some enterprising American entrepreneur will either buy TikTok or develop something along the lines of what TikTok is and make it a thriving business. The government doesn't need to be involved in this other than keeping China out.
Right. I wanted to get to some other matters, too. Let's start with the pardons, the J6 pardons. The Wall Street Journal opining that the essentially blanket pardon of J6 defendants, this is a rotten message from a president about political violence done on his behalf, and it's a bait and switch. He had previously said, I'm going to do this on a case-by-case basis, and if they were nonviolent, I think they've been greatly punished. We're going to look at each individual case. That's what J.D. Vance said. That's what Pam Bondi said during her confirmation hearing. But that's, of course, not what happened. And I was, sort of in that camp as well. But one of the things I started thinking about, Andy, and I wanted to get your take on, is the context of this all, and sort of a quasi fruit of the poisonous tree argument. I mean, thinking about all that has transpired, the misuse of 1512 from Sarbanes-Oxley to overcharge J6 defendants, the lack of disclosure from the FBI, the unanswered questions about potential entrapment or instigation, the sanctions for not disclosing exculpatory evidence. I'm thinking about the QAnon shaman case in particular. I mean, there were so many bad acts conducted by the federal government with respect to this whole category of cases that I'm somewhat more sympathetic to the decision Trump made than I was when we were thinking about it pre-election. Am I wrong?
Yeah. Look, I can't rationalize. I agree not only with most of what you laid out. I mean, the entrapment thing, we've talked about this before, I think. I handle a lot of entrapment type cases on the appellate level and at the trial level when I was a prosecutor for 20 years. People don't get entrapped into violent crime. It just doesn't, I remember asking a jury in the terrorism case after the defense lawyers in my case said that, they were set up by the government. They thought they were training to go to Bosnia, not to blow up targets in New York. And I asked the jury at the end of the case, what would someone have to say to you to convince you to commit mass murder? Nobody gets entrapped into that sort of thing. You get entrapped into, the postal inspectors keep hitting you 25 times to try to get you to buy kiddie porn. Those kinds of cases, sure. But no one gets entrapped into committing violent crime. I also think, putting the entrapment thing aside, the Democrats are being hoisted on their own petard here because they tried to turn this thing into something it wasn't. It was a condemnable riot, but it was a 3-hour affair where the property damage was so minimal that Congress was able to reconvene and no security forces were killed. And yet they've said again and again and again that this was a terrorist attack on the level of 9/11 because democracy itself was hanging by a thread. And they continue to say that between 5 and 8 police officers were killed.
Right.
So I think when people look at this, they say this whole thing was a charade and a sham that the Democrats way overplayed. I think they did. When I was a prosecutor doing terrorism cases, in the Blind Shake case, we probably sent out 2,000, 3,000 leads in the case to FBI offices all over the country to follow for the purposes of the investigation. But it was all from the same case. It was our case. What the FBI did here in order to help the Democrats show that there was supposedly a surge of domestic terrorism was every time they sent out a lead, they opened up a new case, which they labeled domestic terrorism. So it wasn't one case where you send out 3,000 leads. It's suddenly we have a surge of 3,000 domestic terrorism.
Right.
So they did a lot to cook the books to turn this into something that wasn't. And as a result, it leaves a bad taste in everybody's mouth. And that's a big reason why Trump is going to get away without this being as much of a political hit as it might otherwise be. But all that said, I don't think you can rationalize into it's okay to assault police officers. No matter all the other abuses can be addressed in the legal system. It's not satisfactory to people because it moves so slowly, but that's the way it works in most cases. But you can't do property damage and you can't assault police officers. And people who do that should do serious time in prison. You could say that, a lot of them have already done 4 or 5 or right. I guess 4 years. And maybe that's enough. To me, it's not enough because I think that, people who assault police officers ought to do serious time. And I think the other thing here to bear in mind is that it's not like Trump didn't know how to draw lines. There were about between 15 and 1,600 pardons. On 14 of the cases, he commuted the sentence.
Right.
That is, he didn't issue a pardon, he commuted the sentence, which means the place he decided to draw lines was these sedition cases where he left the conviction in place but let them out of prison. Personally, having done a seditious conspiracy case in the 1990s, I've always thought that the sedition convictions would be overturned on appeal. And I think that for the same reason that Jack Smith couldn't bring an insurrection case here, which is to say, to the extent people committed violence, in this instance, they were not committing violence against the United States. They thought they were doing it on behalf of the president, the head of the executive branch, against people who were trying to steal the election. Now, you could say they were completely wrong, but it's not a sedition case unless you're opposing the government. And if you think that you're supporting the commander-in-chief and the chief executive of the government, I don't think you have a sedition case. But whether I'm right or wrong about that, it shows that Trump knew how to draw lines. And I don't understand, if you're going to draw lines at sedition, why don't you draw lines at people who assault police officers?
Yeah. But what was your reaction when he called them hostages, the J6ers?
Oh, I just think that's a bunch of, look, it's red meat, it's purple prose for rallies. The people who, a lot of people who are hardcore MAGA people are very sympathetic to not only the people who were at the Capitol riot, but the myths that have grown out around the Capitol riot, and they try to equate them with political prisoners. And the reason they're able to make a sympathetic pitch on this is the left, which has been governing the country for 12 out of the last 16 years, it will do utterly nothing with respect to left-wing radicalism. So as a result, we've had much more extensive and lethal left-wing rioting in the United States that has gone totally unaddressed. And yet these people who were in a 3-hour riot where nobody in the security forces was killed and there was minimal damage to the facility, they were treated like they were, as the left put it, insurrectionists. And the people who did real violence and actually killed police officers, a lot of those mobs are unscathed by the legal system, and I think it gets people angry, and I understand why it gets people. I don't think it excuses saying stuff that's not true, but I understand the anger about it.
I wanted to get your the application of your legal acumen to one other matter, and that's birthright citizenship. This has been long debated. Now it's going to be again because of the executive order that Trump signed, and that obviously is immediately the subject of litigation. The idea that this could be revisited, and the precedent set in that 1898 case involving a Chinese national, Wong Kim Ark, could be revisited potentially by the Supreme Court because, the facts in that case are not, exactly the facts in many of the cases in this country in 2025 America. And I just wonder what you think about the prospect of relitigating what the Citizenship Clause in the 14th Amendment means.
Dan, I knew you were going to quiz me on this today, so I read that case before we got on, before we started our discussion today. Okay. To go back and look at it. So I'm, in my mind, I'm sort of at war with myself over what I think the right policy is and what I think there's a fair argument that the original understanding of the 14th Amendment is. The Wong Kim Ark case is not precisely what we're dealing with here. Mm-hmm. Wong Kim Ark was born in California of Chinese parents who, as the case says again and again, were domiciled and operating a business in the United States. Now, we didn't have the same... Well, that's the issue. I mean, they don't come out and say that. They basically say, because things were loosey-goosey in the 19th century compared to now, right? So they operated a business in California for a number of years, were domiciled there. No one in the opinion says that they were here illegally, but at the same time, they don't come out and say they were here legally either. And the child was born here and then left and tried to come back, and that's when they tried to stop him from coming in. And the issue was whether the child, who by, I think the time of the case was about 21, was an American citizen or not. And what the court says basically is when the 14th Amendment was adopted, the common law of England, on which these concepts of citizenship and who was a subject and what jurisdiction meant and all that, it was the law of England that if you were if the parents were foreign-born and the child is born in the United States, the child is a citizen of the United States, with the exception of children who were born of diplomats, or this unusual situation which we hadn't had in the United States of part of the United States is taken in basically a war situation. So you have like a foreign army occupying part of the United States and children are born. They deem that to be, those children are subjects of the foreign country, not the United States. But with those two narrow exceptions, if you were born here, if you were born within the realm, it was deemed that you were under the protection of the sovereign, and then that you also had a right to, you had a duty to obey the laws of the sovereign. I don't like that because I think it's much more sensible to have a situation where the child's citizenship should derive from the parents. And we certainly do that with respect to Americans overseas. So, like if an American married couple goes on vacation and the wife, say, gives birth, that child's an American, even if the child is born overseas because of the American citizenship of the parents. I think that should work reciprocally, but I think it's tough to argue, given that case, that the original understanding of the 14th Amendment was not that if you were born within the United States, you're a citizen.
Yeah, I mean, my sense too is that that's what would be required to change the policy is amending the 14th Amendment, but that seems to that prospect obviously is daunting to say the least. Andy McCarthy is former chief assistant U.S. attorney, contributing editor at National Review, also author of the bestseller Ball of Collusion, The Plot to Rig an Election and Destroy a Presidency. Andy, thank you as always. Appreciate it.
Thanks, guys. Have a great day.
You too, and he joined us on our turnkey.pro answer line.
Listen to Dan and Amy on your smartphone. Download the AM560 mobile app today at 560theanswer.com/mobile.
I found a fountain of youth down there at QC Kinetics.
That's Henry Hinton, feeling like his young, active self again after treatments at QC.